There is a single factory in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, that quietly produces more American rye whiskey than any other facility on Earth. And the brands sitting on your shelf right now are almost certainly using it, while pretending they aren't. One building, one company, 50 different craft labels on the bottles it fills, and almost none of those brands will tell you that on the label. The American whiskey boom is one of the great marketing success stories of the last 20 years. In 2005, fewer than 100 distilleries operated in the entire United States. By 2025, that number had exploded past 3,100. The press called it a renaissance, a craft revolution. Reporters wrote breathless features about small-batch heritage spirits and third-generation distillers reclaiming their birthright. Whiskey bars started dedicating entire shelves to indie brands with hand-painted labels and stories about limestone water and Kentucky soil. Most of it was fiction, because here's the number that the industry does not advertise. Of those 3,100-plus distilleries, the overwhelming majority are not distilling anything. They are bottlers, marketers, companies that buy finished whiskey in bulk, pour it into prettier bottles, attach a compelling backstory, and sell it to you at a 300% markup. The distillery revolution was real, but what most consumers got was a branding revolution dressed up in distillery clothes. And at the center of it all is MGP Ingredients, based in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, a company that, for the better part of a decade, produced roughly 70% of all rye whiskey sold in America. Not 70% of one brand, 70% of the entire category. Their annual revenue peaked at $782.4 million in 2022. They weren't a hidden player. They were the industry. They just weren't on the label. So how did this happen? And more importantly, how do you spot it? Start with the legal framework. Once you see how the rules are written, the deception makes perfect sense. The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, regulates what goes on a whiskey label. And there are three phrases that look nearly identical to the average consumer, but mean completely different things. Bottled by means the company put the liquid in the bottle. That's it. They didn't make anything. Produced by is only slightly more involved. It covers blending or mixing, but again, no distillation required. The only phrase that actually confirms a company made the whiskey from scratch is distilled by. 3 words. Most people have never looked for them. Here's what the TTB does not require: any disclosure of the actual source distillery. There is no law compelling a brand to tell you where their whiskey was actually made. None. And here's the other piece. The words craft, small batch, artisan, and handcrafted have zero legal definition under federal law. None of them mean anything. A factory in Indiana producing millions of proof gallons a year can legally supply whiskey that ends up labeled small batch artisan craft spirit on the shelf. That is not a loophole. That is the entire system. Now let's talk about the case that blew the whole thing open. Templeton Rye. If you've been in a whiskey bar in the last 15 years, you've seen the bottle. The story was irresistible. A small batch rye whiskey made in Templeton, Iowa, using a secret Prohibition-era recipe that supposedly fueled Al Capone's operation. The branding was airtight. They sold t-shirts that said "Made in Iowa." The mythology around Capone and the Iowa connection was prominent, consistent, and everywhere. Every single drop of Templeton Rye was distilled at MGP in Indiana, from day one. Not some of it, all of it. When this came out, it triggered a class action lawsuit. The settlement was $2.5 million. And the label now reads, "Distilled in Indiana." A change so small, most people would never catch it while grabbing a bottle off the shelf. Templeton Rye is the cleanest example in the industry of what happens when the story is completely disconnected from the liquid. Iowa branding, Iowa mythology, Indiana whiskey, and a marketing budget big enough to keep most consumers from ever asking the question. But Templeton isn't alone, not even close. Think about Bulleit, one of the most recognizable bourbon brands in the country. That pioneering frontier-branded amber bottle, sitting in every bar in America. What most people don't know is that for years, Bulleit bourbon was not distilled by Bulleit at all. It was produced at Four Roses, a distillery in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, and Bulleit Rye, that's been MGP Indiana from the start. Diageo, the multi-billion-dollar British spirits conglomerate that owns Bulleit, eventually opened a $115 million dedicated Bulleit distillery in 2017. Good for them, but the sourced era was never proactively disclosed to consumers. It just quietly faded out, the way these things tend to do. Here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, a little strange when you think about it. Whistle Pig is a rye whiskey brand that markets itself with imagery of a Vermont farm, rolling green fields, artisan production. The price reflects that story. $130 to $165 for their flagship 10-year bottle. At launch, that whiskey was sourced entirely from Alberta distillers in Canada, not Vermont, Canada. And here's the kicker: the Alberta cask strength expression, made from the same liquid, was available for around $70. So you were paying Vermont farm prices for Alberta grain, in a bottle designed to make you feel like you were buying something small and local and hand-tended. The Vermont farm was real. The distillation connection to it was not. There's a phrase that whiskey writer and historian Chuck Cowdery coined for this phenomenon: the Potemkin Distillery. Named after the fake villages allegedly constructed to impress Catherine the Great on her tour of Crimea. Beautiful facades with nothing behind them. In the whiskey world, it describes a real and widespread practice. Brands that install gleaming copper pot stills in their tasting rooms, photograph them for Instagram, put them in their brand story, while the actual whiskey being sold was distilled somewhere else entirely. The stills in the lobby are decorative, they are props. Cowdery's line on this is worth repeating. The only people who can't put up a true statement about how their product is made are the ones who don't want to tell the truth. That quote was actually cited by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in a related case. It landed. And that hands you a practical test you can run on any bottle right now. Call it the age paradox. Keep it simple. If a craft distillery opened 3 years ago and they're selling a 6-year bourbon, think about that. Whiskey takes years to age. It doesn't come out of the still ready to drink. If the math doesn't work, if the whiskey is older than the distillery's founding date, then by definition, they didn't make it. Someone else did. It was sitting in a barrel somewhere long before that brand existed. The label won't tell you that. The age statement will, if you do the math yourself. Angel's Envy is another one worth examining. The bourbon is now largely in-house production since their Louisville distillery opened in 2016, which is a legitimate achievement. But the rye expression, the one with the plantation rum cask finish that everyone loves, is still sourced from MGP Indiana, specifically the 95% rye mash bill that MGP is famous for. Angel's Envy is owned by Bacardi. None of this is disclosed on the front label. You have to know to look. Tin Cup Whiskey, Colorado Mountains on the label, Rocky Mountain imagery throughout, the name itself conjuring frontier prospectors and clean alpine streams. Sourced primarily from MGP Indiana, not Colorado, Indiana. Now, before this starts sounding like a takedown of everyone who ever put a brand on a whiskey bottle, be clear about something. Sourcing whiskey is not inherently dishonest, not even a little. Some of the best whiskey in the world is made by blenders and selectors who have no grain or still of their own but possess extraordinary skill in identifying and combining exceptional barrels. That is a real craft. Barrel Craft Spirits is the gold standard example of this done right. They source openly, they disclose everything, and they win blind tasting competitions against distillers who have been at it for generations. Their business model is transparent and consumers know exactly what they're buying. The problem has never been sourcing. The problem is deception. It's the Iowa t-shirts. It's the Vermont farm story on a Canadian liquid. It's the copper still in the lobby that has never had a drop of whiskey run through it. It's the $160 price tag on something another company distilled. And the industry is now facing a reckoning it cannot outrun. MGP recently announced it is pulling back from contract production. For years it supplied roughly 50 brand names with finished spirits. Now the company is shifting focus toward its own branded portfolio. Rossville Union, George Remus, Penelope, because the math changed. There is simply more whiskey in circulation than the American market can absorb. The boom created oversupply, and MGP has decided it would rather build its own brands than keep filling bottles for labels that compete with it on the same shelf. That decision is going to break a lot of brands. Quietly, over the next few years, dozens of NDPs, non-distiller producers, will lose access to the liquid their entire business was built around. Some will scramble to find alternative sources. Some will start distilling for real, which takes capital, time, and expertise they may not have. Some will simply fold. The bottlers who built their brands on compelling fiction are about to find out what happens when the factory stops picking up the phone. And the market is already sending signals. American whiskey sales declined in 2023 for the first time in over 20 years. Then they declined again in 2024. The brands most exposed to that downturn are not the genuine distillers. The Buffalo Traces, the Wild Turkeys, the Heaven Hills, the Brown-Formans behind Woodford Reserve and Old Forester, who grow grain, run stills, manage aging warehouses, and have been doing all of that for decades. Those companies aren't going anywhere. The vulnerable ones are the brands built entirely on sourced liquid and a story that stops holding together the moment someone asks a pointed question. Bardstown Bourbon Company in Kentucky is positioning itself as the next large-scale contract distiller to fill the gap MGP is leaving. They produce over 7 million proof gallons a year and count Belle Meade, Hirsch, Jefferson's, James E. Pepper, and Calumet among their known clients. So the structure isn't disappearing, it's shifting. Which means the same transparency problem will continue until consumers demand different behavior from the brands they're buying. Here's what the Daily Beast called it, in a headline that made the industry uncomfortable for about 2 weeks before the next news cycle swallowed it. Your craft whiskey is probably from a factory distillery in Indiana. They described MGP as a one-stop shop for marketers who want to bottle their own brands without distilling the product themselves. That was years ago. The structure described in that article is still largely intact today. What's interesting, and this part often surprises people, is that MGP itself has said publicly it actively encourages its NDP customers to disclose where their whiskey was made. The secrecy is not the supplier's preference. The supplier has no reason to hide. It's the brands that choose to bury it, because the whole business model depends on you believing the story on the front of the bottle, rather than reading the fine print on the back. So what do you actually do with this information? Flip the bottle over. Find those 3 words, distilled by. If you see bottled by or produced by, you now know to ask more questions. Check the distillery's founding date against the age of the whiskey they're selling. If a brand launched in 2019 and is selling an 8-year expression in 2025, the math tells you something the label won't. Look for brands that have been transparent. Barrel Craft Spirits names their sources. Michters and Willett both moved from source to in-house production and told people about it, and their loyal customers respected them more for the honesty, not less. And if a brand is charging you $150 for a small batch artisan craft whiskey with beautiful packaging and a great origin story, and the word distilled by is nowhere on that bottle, you are paying for the story, not the whiskey. The story is what costs $80 a bottle. The liquid is what it is. Genuine distillers are doing extraordinary work right now. The craft revolution, even if it got overrun by marketers, produced real distillers who built real operations with real character and skill. They put their name and their founding date and the words distilled by on their bottles because they have nothing to hide. Those are the bottles worth the premium. The industry secret isn't some buried conspiracy. It's been sitting in plain sight on every label you've ever picked up, if you knew exactly where to look. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever bought a bottle that turned out to be sourced? Did you feel deceived? Or did you just shrug it off because the whiskey was good? Drop that in the comments. I read every single one, and this is genuinely one of the most interesting debates in the spirits world right now. If this changed how you'll look at a whiskey label the next time you're standing in a store, hit the like button and share it with someone who actually cares about what's in their glass. And if you're not subscribed yet, fix that now, because next week we're going inside the barrel auction market, where whiskey investors are paying more per barrel than most people pay for a car, and the numbers are absolutely wild.